Shalom. Welcome to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I am joined in the studio by no one today. You, the viewers and listeners, are my guest today. I'm not going to be taking phone calls, but I will be monitoring the chat room, which you can find at, if you go to webcast1live.com, and you'll see the viewer there that you watch the show live. There's a little button on the bottom of the viewer that says chat. And if you click on that button, you'll be able to join the chat room, and then you can ask any questions you'd want. I will be, as I've already posted in the chat room, taking appropriate questions about the topics we're going to discuss today. Now, I will be discussing today. I have to tell you, the topics dealing with the Supreme Court decisions on the same-sex marriage issues and also the Voting Rights Act, among other things we're going to talk about today. The comments have been so heated on Facebook that I've seen, and I know in the broader media, that it's been very difficult. And some of the things I've heard today and seen today online have been very troubling. We're going to start off with the world in 5 minutes and just kind of go through what's going on in the world. So as far as the big news this week, there was the Supreme Court decisions, 3 major decisions, which I'll be discussing later in the show. The first one being a declaration that Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is no longer constitutional because the requirements that are involved in that act are not up to date, essentially, and are therefore being applied unfairly. Well, I'm going to read a couple of different articles that relate to that and comment on those. I'll share some of the views on those from various perspectives. I also want to talk a little bit about the Supreme Court decisions from yesterday concerning same-sex marriage and 2 different major pieces of legislation that the Supreme Court ruled on. The first one is they decided to allow a lower court decision, an appellate court decision from California that said that the DOMA Act, the act that essentially that Proposition 8, which is a California piece of legislation, was unconstitutional on a number of different grounds. And the second one is the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, which was passed by Congress during the Clinton administration, which was found to have some unconstitutional properties by the court. And I want to get into those decisions and what I think the impact is going to be and what other people think the impact may be. We're also going to look specifically at an article, or I'll talk specifically about an article by Bradley Miller about same-sex marriage 10 years on, lessons from Canada, and some of the concerns that people in the religious right in the Christian community who are opposed to same-sex marriage have. And in my mind, some of those are concerns that I think people who are more progressive should also concern themselves with. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. This week, we also see Edward Snowden starring in Terminal 2, the sequel to the Tom Hanks movie, spending his time living in the Moscow airport because he is literally a man without a country at the moment. His passport has been revoked, and no one is willing to give him asylum at the moment. Ecuador is considering it, but we'll talk more specifically about that. Also, the clear trend from Snowden, or concerning Snowden, from being a hero whistleblower in some circles to now being considered more of a traitor and concern of espionage. And so we'll talk about that as we move forward. Finally, there's the entire push to restart the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians, which seems to be going nowhere fast. And there's more and more attention being given to trying to get it started, but the impediments are so obvious on one side, and the argument being made on the other side seems to have such obvious arguments against it. that I have difficulty at least seeing why there is any real thought that the process can move forward at this point and people should be expending energy in it. So those are really the major topics that are going on this week, and we will address them over the next little bit on this show. That is the world in 5 minutes.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
I'm Brian Leach, owner and general manager of Service Legends. I brought along a couple of the home comfort heroes.
Hi, I'm Tammy Wells.
I am Nick Wondershad.
I'm administrative manager
I am the senior technician.
from Service Legends.
It seems like every good thing, when you feel it to the bone that it's good, there's a lot of hard work put behind it. I don't think that you can fake it and have it turn out good.
You know, if we seem like, okay, that's just weird, it's just a furnace, why would you believe so deeply in a furnace? It's not just that, you know, we want to show the world that you can have good service.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be, it's your home.
You know, it's built into our daily trainings, it's built into our culture, that we're gonna do whatever it takes to have each client say they love us, period.
That's why we spend all the hours in the training that we do. And if we guarantee it's going to be a good experience for you, or else it's free, what type of work do you think we're going to do?
There is a guarantee.
Temperature selection guarantee, fixed right or it's free guarantee, comfort guarantee, best value guarantee. All of these guarantees hold us accountable to ensuring that we exceed your expectations. And if for whatever reason we'd fail and we can't make it right, we guarantee all of those guarantees with a 100% money back guarantee.
I mean, if you don't think that your technician can fix it right, are you gonna say that to a client? No.
You don't have to worry about having a technician come to your house.
We drug test, background check all of our team members. We put safe people in your home. Each and every one of our service techs, 400 hours a year in training.
You tell it the minute they walk in the door. They know what they're doing, they've done their homework, and they actually truly care about what you want.
Because at the end of the day, you're the person that makes sure I have a job.
They're gonna be listening. They're gonna wanna know what your challenges are. Then they're gonna come and give you options, and you get to choose.
If I'm there to help and I make it easy and painless, I did my job right that day.
Well, when it comes to your comfort, safety, and your family, you know, you don't necessarily go buy the most expensive, but you get the most bang for your buck.
Oh, it's worth it, because there's a lot of people that will find a way to get it to work right now and then leave and then come back, charge you again, and the cycle just repeats itself. So when I'm out there looking at the furnace, I want to find why it failed today. How can we change the part today with something that you're not going to have to worry about? Is it worth changing the part today? I mean, you can put a lot of money into a furnace. I can fix parts all day. There's good job security in that for me, but is it the right thing for you?
I get a lot of the phone calls of after the technicians are there. They're just in awe. They're like, wow, you guys are great. I mean, I don't even know what to say. You guys are great. Everything you did was perfect. It was great.
Keep going though, I like this.
Just give us a try. I'm gonna take all the risk.
I've got the time to make this right. I've got the support to make it right.
Just check us out.
And if you don't see the value in what we do,
I mean, fixed right or it's free or 100% money back.
enough said.
Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I'm all by myself in the studio today, but you're welcome to join me in the chat room, which you can find under the Webcast One Live viewer or on the viewer on onetotalkto.com. You'll see a little word chat right under the image coming across your screen. And if you happen to be online and you happen to want to ask a question, feel free to do that. I'm hoping to anticipate much of your questions. And so as I do the show, hopefully your questions will be addressed anyway. Yesterday, of course, the big news is that the Supreme Court came out and upheld the appellate court decision in California, declaring that Proposition 8 in California was unconstitutional on a whole host of grounds, and that the Defense of Marriage Act, which was passed by Congress during the Clinton administration and was signed by President Clinton, by the way, was also unconstitutional in how it applied the law to people who are lesbian, gay, transgender, and bisexual. And the implications of these decisions, you can find lots and lots about the decisions themselves online. I'm more concerned today about the reaction to the decisions, frankly. First of all, I need to say that while I think it's appropriate for people like myself who are supporters of same-sex unions, or the ability for people who want same-sex unions to get them, and I'll go into my reasoning for that in a little bit, I think it's too early to be jubilant. The fight for recognition of equal rights and equal treatment under the law is a long way from being over. These were decisions that were helpful in the long run in that pursuit. But we're not talking about same-sex marriage being legal in every state and equal protection under the law, and it's on and on and on. It's all a done deal. We're just not there. For me, just to tell you where I come from, I'm a Reform rabbi, Reform Jewish rabbi. The Reform movement is a very strong supporter of same-sex unions, of marriage protection, equality under the law, separation of church and state, all of those things. Personally, I believe that the state should have nothing to do with the marriage process, that that states and the federal government should deal with civil unions, and that religious institutions alone should define what marriage is in their religious institutions. Religious institutions all around the country differ, all around the world, differ in what they believe constitutes a valid marriage, what is okay to have happen in that marriage, how you get out of a marriage, if you're allowed to get out of a marriage, all of those various things. The government has no business there. The government even mentioning the word marriage in any format whatsoever is an intrusion into something that belongs in the religious realm. The fact that states still require or still even allow or expect in any fashion whatsoever ministers and rabbis to function as functionaries of the state, signing official state documents relating to a marriage, in my mind, is inappropriate. The state should deal with those things on its own. And when a couple, whether it's a heterosexual couple or a homosexual couple, comes to a religious leader, the religious leader should not have to worry whatsoever about what the law is or anything else. It should be solely at the discretion of the religious leader within an institution. I believe very strongly in a separation of church and state. You will see in my many writings and on this show historically that I've spoken very strongly for that. I speak out very publicly in the newspaper and the media when I'm asked about that. I am a very strong supporter of separation of church and state. And I think it's important for people on the religious right to understand that I see this as an issue that strengthens religious institutions, not one that weakens them. Now, are there concerns that the future ahead could lead to a weakening of religious institutions' strength vis-a-vis the government? Absolutely. I am a small government guy. Okay, I believe that the best government is the least government necessary. That's very simply the way I believe. I think there's a role of government in different places, but I believe that government intrusion should be as little as humanly possible. Immediately following the decision yesterday, Breitbart, which is a conservative media outlet, came out with an article that essentially argues that religious institutions in the United States and religious leaders in the United States may, or ministers, rabbis, and others may find themselves forced to perform same-sex marriages or find tax-exempt status in question. Here's what the article says, and this is written by Ben Shapiro, who's a columnist at Breitbart. Based on Wednesday's Supreme Court ruling in which the court majority determined that the Defense of Marriage Act's federal definition of marriage had to incorporate state-based same-sex marriages, Internal Revenue Service regulations could be modified to remove nonprofit status for churches across the country. Now, in that case, here's a place where I, as a separation of church and state person, in the political center, even leaning left on a number of issues, would say that I'm in agreement with the the Christian right here. I believe that the IRS should in no way even think about doing that. This is an issue of separation of church and state. Okay? The government shouldn't be telling anybody what they have to do as a religious practice. That's not reasonable. Somebody who is in a same-sex relationship who wants to get married should go to a religious institution and to a religious leader specifically, like myself, if you happen to be Reformed Jewish or Jewish in general, we'll talk about it, if you're interested in that kind of marriage. You don't go to a fundamentalist Christian minister who's going to tell you that what you're doing is sinful and wants to argue against same-sex marriage. That's just wrong, and the government should not force that upon ministers. Let's make that very simple. The government should have nothing to do with marriage, and it certainly should not be forcing ministers to adhere to a set of religious values that they don't believe in under penalty of losing their tax-exempt status. That would be wrong. The DOMA decision, this is the Breitbart article continued, makes clear that marriage is a state-to-state issue, meaning that religious institutions that receive nonprofit status in the federal level but do not perform or accept same-sex marriages in states where it is legal could have nonprofit status revoked. Like I said, that would be wrong in my opinion. Furthermore, should the IRS move to revoke federal nonprofit status for churches, synagogues, and mosques that do not perform same-sex marriages, the court could easily justify that decision on the basis of eradicating discrimination in religious education. Okay, now, I think that would be a very questionable decision. I think it's fairly obvious that freedom of religion would trump that. Now, I will grant you, immediately following that, Breitbart cites something which is a very problematic piece of jurisprudence in my mind, at least to apply to this situation, okay? He said in 1983, the Supreme Court ruled in Bob Jones University versus the United States that it was within the scope of the First Amendment's protections for religion for the IRS to revoke the tax-exempt status for the university based on its policy prohibiting interracial dating. The court determined that the government had a fundamental overriding interest in eradicating racial discrimination in education, which substantially outweighs whatever burden, denial, or tax benefits places on the university's exercise of their religious beliefs. Okay, now, I do see that there are going to be places where discrimination against homosexuals and discrimination based on race are going to meet. Okay, there are places. The difference between prohibiting interracial dating and not agreeing to perform same-sex marriages, in my mind, is a different issue. Okay, because what I would say here is that a university that the question would be, I guess, whether or not a university could lose its tax-exempt funding if it comes out against homosexuals at all. If it comes out against homosexual behavior, potentially that could be a realistic issue. In which case, then you're going to have religious institutions, potentially Catholic universities and others, that may have policies dealing with that. I don't know of any specifically that have overt policies saying that that's not okay and that students could be expelled because of that behavior. But it's certainly possible that if institutions did have those points of view, that they could then potentially, realistically, come into conflict with the law. Now, I don't support those religious points of view. Don't for a moment say that I'm going to support a point of view that prohibits that kind of dating. The question is whether or not the United States should allow religious institutions to make decisions based on religious points of view. That's the real question here. Now, is prohibiting interracial dating the same as prohibiting homosexual behavior? Now, I'm not so sure that that's true. The bigger picture, though, is if you're in a homosexual relationship and you know you're geared, your body's wired in that way, why would you go to a university that would be hostile? Different question. Okay, and I think to a certain extent the court would need to address that question. But I think there are real fears among places that wish to discriminate based on their religious faith, based on the trend, the legal trend that we're seeing in these decisions. And the overriding question that we're going to need to see is, when does religious freedom trump individual rights? And if the answer is never, then obviously that's one possibility. And if the answer is different times, I think that needs to be clear. But in the meantime, there's certainly a slippery slope here that people are afraid of, or at least they're afraid there's a slippery slope, that this is simply not going to stop. Is there going to be a time when the court can revoke nonprofit status based on this, just in general, because religious institutions don't believe in supporting homosexuals or same-sex marriage? I don't know. To be perfectly honest, I really don't know. I would think that you can't have legislation passed or policies enforced such that, depending on whether you have a conservative Republican administration or a progressive Democrat administration come into office, that the policies would flip back and forth, because that would create complete chaos. So you need to have some sort of solution that makes sense for both conservatives and Democrats. And what that would be, I don't know. You clearly cannot go to religious institutions and tell them that they cannot be religious institutions, that they have to follow your beliefs and not theirs, because then you run the risk of saying that religious institutions simply cannot exist, or at least cannot exist in dealing with the federal government on any level. There already are situations in which Catholic organizations that do adoptions, who want to discriminate and not allow homosexual couples to adopt children from their organizations, have been told that they're not allowed to do that, in which case some of them have decided that they can't operate. Now, we have to decide, are we better off with those institutions being able to take care of children based on their religious beliefs, even though they're discriminatory, or to eliminate them altogether and say that any organization that discriminates cannot function? That's a really tough decision. It's not a simple decision. And from a Jewish perspective, it's important to realize that the Jewish people have historically faced numerous times where, because we didn't adhere to the norms of the society, the Christian norms of the society in Christian Europe, or the Muslim norms of the society in the Arab world, that we weren't able to function in the regular society. It becomes problematic for us, for me as an independent, as a social libertarian, as a progressive thinker, to simply say that that's okay. I believe in a separation of church and state, and I believe that institutions should be allowed to make decisions based on their own perspective. Now, then brings into question is, should there be tax-exempt status, and what are the implications of organizations that are not following socially accepted norms getting tax-exempt status or not getting tax-exempt status? You run into some really huge problems at that point when you get into that kind of questioning. So these are not simple decisions whatsoever, but they're decisions that we're going to be dealing with going forward for generations, or at least for quite a few years as this plays out. I mean, like I said early on, we're not at a point where everything is settled and none of these issues are going to come up. And there are going to be elections going forward, and there's going to be legislation in various states challenging these Supreme Court decisions or trying to create new ways to get around the Supreme Court decisions. There may well be congressional legislation at some point dealing with that. You may have elections in which a president comes in who's more conservative and creates executive orders dealing with some of this stuff. These things are not just settled plainly. There's certainly the opportunity for many more challenges to come. My simple response, my initial response to these challenges that we're dealing with quite a bit of difficulty, was to react, no way, these things are not going to happen. And I think there's a little bit more validity to the challenges, that the difficulty and that some religious institutions are going to face going forward than I initially thought. Now, I saw an article about same-sex marriage 10 years on, lessons from Canada. It's written by Bradley Miller from Public Discourse. I think it's publicdiscourse.com, if I'm thepublicdiscourse.com. This actually came from last year. It's from November 2012. And he was talking about the effects of same-sex civil marriage in Canada. Now, this is somebody who's a political conservative, who's a religious conservative, somebody who was opposed to same-sex marriage, who's writing about the implications of it. What he says is kind of an interesting issue. He talks about the impact on human rights, and he says the formal effect of the judicial decisions and subsequent legislation establishing same-sex civil marriage in Canada was simply that persons of the same sex could now have the government recognize their relationships as marriages. But the legal and cultural effect was much broader. What transpired was the adoption of a new orthodoxy, that the same-sex relationships are, in every way, the equivalent of traditional marriage, and that same-sex marriage must therefore be treated identically to traditional marriage in law and public life. Okay, now, personally, I'm in favor of that. Whether you say it's exactly the same as traditional marriage or not, I believe that is what I would want, that same-sex marriages would be an acceptable norm, not necessarily the traditional norm, but an alternative norm, and that children who grow up in such households, and yes, same-sex couples can and often do have children, would then feel like they're not from some crazy wacko household, but something that is a reasonable norm, if not the traditional norm, and that they would be treated as a normal kid growing up, as a normal person. That would be my hope. What he says, though, as an alternative here is that a corollary is that anyone who rejects the new orthodoxy must be acting on the basis of bigotry and animus toward gays and lesbians. Any statement of disagreement with same-sex civil marriage is thus considered a straightforward manifestation of hatred toward a minority sexual group. Any reasoned explanation, for example, those were offered in legal arguments that same-sex marriage is incompatible with the conception of marriage, the response to the needs of children, and the marriage for stability, fidelity. So as he's going on, he's saying that those are dismissed right away as mere pretext. Now, here's the issue. I believe that free dialogue is important. I believe that understanding people's differing views is important. I believe that allowing people to express their religious views is important. The issue that comes up is that there is a difference on what science says, between what fundamentalists and others who oppose same-sex marriage argue is the truth, and what those in various universities in general believe is the truth about homosexuality and homosexual relationships and homosexual parenting. Okay, my experience, and I do have some experience working with same-sex couples, is that the arguments that I just read off about these various problems within same-sex households or potential problems within same-sex households are not true at all. In fact, I would argue that there are certainly heterosexual people who are basically serial divorcers who get into relationships over and over and over again whose households are not stable. There are certainly heterosexuals who are abusive to their children. These problems are not grossly different in same-sex couples, and to argue that is simply not realistic. In addition to that, at this point, those same-sex couples who are seeking to be married tend to be overwhelmingly more committed and have spent longer period of time with one another than most of the heterosexual couples who come to get married. Many of these same-sex couples that are getting married now have been together for a decade or longer. So this idea that they're all over and just doing it for the hell of it, getting married for the heck of it, is not a real valid argument. So this article from Canada says, when one understands opposition to same-sex marriage as a manifestation of sheer bigotry and hatred, it becomes very hard to tolerate continued dissent. Okay, so here's the thing. Somebody who tells me that they're a Bible-believing Christian and they oppose same-sex marriage because that's what the Bible says, that's a valid opposition in my mind. That's valid. That's just what they believe. That's who they are. That's fine. The people who oppose it and start talking about how everyone is going to hell, everyone is sinful, society that supports them is supporting Satan and everybody's going to hell, anybody who has anything to do with them is going to hell, anybody who supports this is supporting Satan, and if we don't act against them, our society is going to be taken over by the devil and all the things are going to befall us. When you get into that kind of language, even if it is religious language, it is definitely hate-filled language. And to argue that religions cannot support hate-filled language is something with, Jews have a very long history of persecution and hatred spewed against us, including violence, murder, and genocide based on religious dictate. So the idea that you can't go from I oppose this, I believe differently, to spewing hatred is simply wrong. Miller, in this argument, in this article, tries to make the argument that they're one and the same. That's not true. You can offer a disagreement based on your religion, have a different point of view based on your religion, but you can also go way beyond that and start spewing legitimate hatred in anybody's mind, and it can be based in your religious faith. It's very easy for people with religious faith to say their hatred is based in their religion. And if that's true, then there are times where it crosses the line. So the question is, where does it cross the line? And what is legitimate discourse? And I think we're having trouble with it right now because what I've seen in the last day dealing with the reaction to the Supreme Court decisions based on Proposition 8 and DOMA has been exactly that some people say, well, I can't support this because I'm a religious person. And other people say, Satan, devil, evil, awful. Anybody who supports this is a horrible human being and they're condemning humanity to eternal damnation and on and on and on and on and on. And when you get into that, you're crossing the line personally, because if you're spewing hatred that could result in people potentially harming other people because you're putting forth that much hatred, and like I said, speaking as someone from the Jewish people who has experienced religious hatred put into physical action, it is certainly possible. These are things we have to be very, very concerned about. And there are many, many, many cases of homosexuals being attacked because people believe that they're inherently evil because they're homosexual, because their religion told them that. So let's not discount the fact that you can cross the line. It's difficult to toe the middle ground, and I toe the middle ground a lot. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to find the line where discourse becomes disagreement and then moves on to more than that and becomes hatred and even something that leads to violent action. That's where a lot of these things are. And we'll talk about some of the other decisions that the Supreme Court put forth in just a little bit. And we're going to take a quick break here because I need a quick break. I want to return to this article about Canada just briefly before we move on to the Voting Rights Act and a few other things that I want to talk about today just in the next 25 minutes. Needless to say, there's a lot to be said about these things. Before I go, I do want to thank Dr. Ronald Bergman of Bergman Folkers Cosmetic Surgery and Spa for his support of this show and enabling me to share my opinions and to bring the guests that I usually have on the show to share their opinions with you. Thank you for joining me on Understanding the World, and we'll be back in just a couple minutes.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
Drink, dance, party. Kitty's is the ultimate dance club in Des Moines. A huge dance floor with room to move, 3 bars to keep your drinks full, and kickin' DJs playing all your favorite dance music. At Kitty's, we've always got your birthday party planned with Birthday Fridays. That's right, when your birthday rolls around, there's only one place to go. Gather up your friends and head to Kitty's, where you drink free on the Friday of your birthday week. Find out more about Birthday Fridays at kittiesusa.com. Kitty's, all kinds of people, all kinds of music, all kinds of fun.
Drug and alcohol addiction slowly steals a person's identity, tearing away pieces of their life little by little until one day it seems like the hope of a happy future is gone and there's no chance of getting it back. Here at St. Gregory Retreat Centers, we can assure you that there is hope. Our unique approach to recovery begins with the understanding that the dysfunction and damage caused by addiction can be overcome, not just dealt with. Don't let another day go by. Call St. Gregory today.
Whether you're 10, 25, 50, 80 years old and beyond, everyone needs to live within their means. I'm Tom Coates with Consumer Credit of America. For almost a quarter of a century, we've helped people of all ages learn to manage their personal finances to benefit them far into the future. When problems arise, we've got the experience you need to make those debt problems go away. Got financial problems? Call Consumer Credit of America.
If Tom Coates from Consumer Credit of America was your personal webmaster, Tom would filter out all bad debt emails. If Tom was your mailman, you'd never get any debt reduction junk mail. If Tom Coates was a lineman, he'd block any phone calls offering to reduce your credit card debt.
Hi, I'm Tom Coates with Consumer Credit of America, and we're still your best choice for credit counseling. We're local, we're accountable, and we can do more. You make the call when the time's right for you.
When it comes to competition, there really is none for Consumer Credit of America.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I've been talking about the Supreme Court decisions on DOMA and Proposition 8. And I was reading from an article by Bradley Miller from thepublicdiscourse.com. He wrote in November of 2012 about same-sex marriage 10 years on, using the Canadian term there, lessons from Canada. And he raises some interesting points that I really do think challenge us when we deal with separation of church and state, and we deal with religious freedom, and we deal with a number of different topics. The issue that comes up, a number of different issues come up. And he talks about, can teachers be held accountable for statements made outside of classrooms in opposition to their same-sex marriage, potentially based on their religious views? What do you do about sexual education and the idea that of teaching about homosexuality in the classroom, and you've got kids who are from religious families in the classrooms, and their religions may oppose homosexuality or teach something else about homosexuality other than what the curriculum is designed to do. What happens when you have an idea, when you have a curriculum designed to prevent bullying, and bullying of homosexuals, gays and lesbians, bisexuals and transgenders is a very huge problem, particularly in high schools and colleges. There are many LGBT individuals who commit suicide every year based on bullying, both in person and cyberbullying, because of their sexual orientation. It's a very real issue. The concern is that these kids need to feel like they're not being persecuted and they're being somewhat understood. But this conflicts. Some of the practices conflict. I wouldn't say the anti-bullying conflicts, but some of the practices that are put in place conflict with the desires of and beliefs of some religious individuals involved in public schools in particular. And so what may end up happening as some of these programs move forward into public schools is some parents may find, especially some of these religious parents, finding themselves taking their children out of public schools and putting them in religious schools. Now, there are a couple different problems there too. First of all, there's a desire to not stress our differences and to have public schools be very functional. And if you keep having every minority group pulling their kids out of public schools for whatever reason, for social reasons, religious reasons, any number of things, you run the risk of having a very polarized society where people can't dialogue and they can't understand each other. You also then run the risk of having schools set up solely or at least significantly based on opposing these views about homosexuals and same-sex marriage, in which case a number of things happen. First of all, there are going to be LGBT individuals in those schools whose parents either don't know that, or some of these kids may not even know that until they get older. They just don't sexualize until a much later date. And oftentimes it's actually those individuals who are the most troubled when they become older and realize that they're LGBT and they've spent their entire life being told how awful that is. Instead of being told that it's okay and LGBT people are normal and that religious institutions, religious traditions had opposed same-sex relationships and same-sex behaviors historically, they're essentially demonized. And at that point, it's very easy to become very depressed, hostile to oneself, and even take action against oneself. So I think that compassionate religious traditions need to come up with better responses to this stuff, better responses to LGBT issues than they've come up with, particularly if they're going to stress a response of pulling their kids out of public schools into parochial schools. Because simply isolation and denial are going to amplify the problem, potentially make the real problem, like I said, the real problem of bullying and the real problem of LGBT suicide much worse in those communities. And that cannot be the religious thing to do. It's certainly not the moral and ethical thing to do. And so it becomes very, very difficult to deal with. Parents need to understand the issue more than homosexuality bad in a religious community. They need to understand what the real issues are. And from experience, I can tell you that many people who grew up with the LGBT bad kind of perspective, once they have children or family members who find themselves to be in the homosexual community, dramatically change their positions almost overnight. So religious conservatives sometimes will find themselves in support of same-sex marriage or in support of equal rights for gays and lesbians because they believe in various freedoms that the United States stands for, instead of trying to push the religious views on everybody else. Okay, so enough about all this stuff. The article that I was just talking about comes from Bradley Miller, The Public Discourse. He goes on to talk about impacts on the conception of marriage and a number of things. The definition of marriage that I think we're going to is a committed relationship between two people in a household, as a very simple definition, potentially with the goal of raising children together, but not necessarily. And that's pretty open definition of marriage, but I think it's what it is. And I think because marriage as a term is religiously loaded, really what you have is a sanctified relationship of two people living together in a household, creating a family together, and that the fact that we're dealing with a sanctified relationship or something that has to do with religion means that we should consider, I think, taking the practice of marriage out of the hands of the state and the federal government and looking at civil unions being what the state and federal government does, and religious institutions being in charge of marriage as such. The bigger picture is that people want to have impact on everybody else. The religious groups want everybody else to respect their views. Everybody else wants the religious groups to respect their views. And sometimes everybody can't win. There are times when those views are in conflict. Which brings us to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Rights Act Section 4 being struck down by the Supreme Court. This article, I'm going to read two articles. One is going to come from the Washington Post. It's going to be by George Will, who's a neoconservative writer, and this one is coming from the Huff Post, which is on the political left. So this is from Ryan Kelly, Mike Sachs, and Sabrina Siddiqui. The Supreme Court struck down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act on Tuesday, the provision of the landmark Civil Rights Act that designates which parts of the country, states, and counties must have changes to their voting laws cleared by the federal government or in federal court before they can put them into practice. The 5-4 ruling, and all of these are 5-4 rulings, by the way, authored by Chief Justice John Roberts and joined by Justices Antonin Scalia, Kennedy, Clarence Thomas, and Samuel Alito, ruled in Shelby County versus Holder that things have changed dramatically in the South in the nearly 50 years since the Voting Rights Act was signed in 1965. The court's opinion said it did not strike down the act of Congress lightly and said it took care to avoid ruling on the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act. The act itself was ruled constitutional. Congress could have updated the coverage formula at the time in 2009, but did not do so. Its failure to act leaves us today with no choice but declare Section 4, which is the section that determines the criteria, which states, essentially, and which counties qualify, unconstitutional. The formula in that section can no longer be used as a basis for subjecting jurisdictions to preclearance. The Voting Rights Act has been used to block a number of things. Voter ID law in Texas, delay in the implementation of another in South Carolina. Both states are no longer subject to the preclearance requirement because of the court's ruling on Tuesday. Our country has changed, and while any racial discrimination in voting is too much, Congress must ensure that the legislation it passes to remedy that problem speaks to current conditions, Roberts wrote. There is no doubt that these improvements are in large part because of the Voting Rights Act, he wrote. The act has proved immensely successful at redressing racial discrimination and integrating the voting process. In his bench statement, Roberts said that Congress had extended a 40-year-old coverage formula based on obsolete statistics and that the coverage formula violates the Constitution. Congress, the court ruled, may draft another formula based on current conditions, but given the fact that Republicans currently control the House of Representatives, many voting rights advocates consider it unlikely that Congress will act to create a new formula. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that the sad irony of today's decision lies in its utter failure to grasp why the Voting Rights Act has proven effective. The court appears to believe that the Voting Rights Act's success in eliminating the specific devices extant in 1965 means that preclearance is no longer needed. The court did not rule on Section 5, the preclearance requirement itself, which requires those affected states to have changed their voting laws. Rather, the court ruled that the current formula that determines which states are covered by Section 5 is unconstitutional, effectively eliminating Section 5 enforcement, at least for the time being. That's essentially what happened. The Chief Counsel for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, John Greenbaum, said the Supreme Court has effectively gutted one of the nation's most important and effective civil rights laws. Minority voters in places with a record of discrimination are now at greater risk of being disenfranchised than they have been in decades. Today's decision is a blow to democracy. Jurisdictions will be able to enact policies which prevent minorities from voting, and the only recourse these citizens will have will be expensive and time-consuming litigation. Okay, and then the president yesterday, right about noon, said, I am deeply disappointed with the Supreme Court's decision today. For nearly 50 years, the Voting Rights Act, enacted and repeatedly renewed by wide bipartisan majorities in Congress, has helped secure the right to vote for millions of Americans. Today's decision, invalidating one of its core provisions, upsets decades of well-established practices that help make sure voting is fair, especially in places where voting discrimination has been historically prevalent. As a nation, we've made a great deal of progress towards guaranteeing every American the right to vote. But as the Supreme Court recognized, voting discrimination still exists. And while today's decision is a setback, it doesn't represent the end of our efforts to end voting discrimination. I'm calling on Congress to pass legislation to ensure every American has equal access to the polls. My administration will continue to do everything in its power to ensure a fair and equal voting process. Okay, so let's talk about just the specifics here. So what ends up happening is the Supreme Court gets rid of the criterion to apply the teeth of the law, which essentially means that the law is no longer functional. George Will, who, as I said, was writing essentially in response to that from a more conservative perspective, says that the Supreme Court is correct on Voting Rights Act. What he said was, the Voting Rights Act is the noblest legislation in United States history, more transformative than the Homestead Act, the Morrill Act, the 1944 GI Bill of Rights, but extraordinary laws that were once constitutional, in spite of being discordant with the nation's constitutional architecture, can become unconstitutional when the facts that made the law appropriate change. The most recent data, such as registration and voting rates on which Section 4 is based, are from 1972. The data would have been 59 years old when the most recent extension expired in 2031. Today's decision prevents this absurdity that Congress embraced. In 2009, the court chose not to rule on the continuing constitutionality of the VRA's formula. The court, Chief Justice Roberts, writing for the majority, clearly challenged Congress to update the VRA because it imposes current burdens and must be justified by current needs. Roberts said that Section 4 on Tuesday is based on decades-old data and eradicated policies. Tuesday's decision came 8 months after a presidential election in which African Americans voted at a higher rate than whites. It came when in a majority of the 9 states covered by the preclearance requirements, blacks are registered at a higher rate than whites. It came when Mississippi has more black elected officials, not more per capita, more than any other state. The Supreme Court's 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision affirming the constitutionality of racial segregation in separate but supposedly equal public accommodations rejected the idea that such segregation imposed a badge of inferiority, but of course it did, as the court acknowledged in 1954. And during oral argument in February, Justice Stephen Breyer suggested that the VRA remains constitutional because it acknowledges the South's continuing moral inferiority. He likened Southern racism to a dormant but still dangerous disease. Breyer's insinuation was that we know the covered jurisdictions remain uniquely diseased, or potentially so. Tuesday, Roberts' response was that the constitutional equality of the states is essential to the harmonious operation of the scheme upon which the republic was organized. Okay, so we run into some real difficulty here. In essence, the only way for these states and counties to prove that they no longer should have this law applied to them is by not doing what they're very likely to do, which is at this point to go and enact what they want as legislation. So we can anticipate a flurry of legislation being passed in many of these states. Some of these things are probably going to be voter ID acts and things like that, which have been tried to pass in other states. The real question is it different for a county in Alabama to pass a voter ID law than it is for a county in Indiana to pass a voter ID law? The answer is probably shouldn't be treated differently. The fact that those states are historically ones in which there has been a problem does not necessarily mean that there still is or is going to be a problem based solely in racism, which is really what this is about. However, there certainly could be. And this is what I think Congress and particular people concerned about voting and concerned about civil rights are going to have to pay attention to. Yes, this law enabled there to be some leeway, a padding, a cushion to prevent law from being enacted that could be problematic. But there's no doubt that it also placed a burden on states and on counties that may or may not have been a legitimate burden to place on them. I know for a fact that prevalent attitudes in North Carolina, for example, where I went to both college and graduate school, were vastly different in 1965 than they were in 1989 and the early 90s when I was there, through the mid 90s when I was there, and they're nowhere close to that now. So the assumption that those areas are necessarily where they were 50 years ago is simply not correct. And if the law can't figure out a way to deal with that, that's a problem. I do think there needs to be a criterion to look at, and the federal government needs to say, here's what's legitimate as far as requirements. Now, you may say some of these things are for the states alone, but there is an issue of where does the federal government have a right to decide the individual rights across all borders, especially when you come to presidential elections, and where do the states have the ability to enact laws that the federal government has to stay out of? I do think there's going to be more legislation dealing with that now that this decision has gone the way it is, because Congress probably will not enact new legislation. Okay, we only got a couple minutes left, and I wanted to touch on two things really briefly just to make you aware of them. One is that I wrote an article for for Times of Israel, actually. I blog for Times of Israel in addition to We Are For Israel, which is my own organization. But on Times of Israel, I wrote about Edward Snowden and the fact, I called it When the Game Turns Dark, Snowden. The reality is he seems to have thought at some point that he was a whistleblower who was doing the right thing, and that he has been trying to find a place where he can hide and not be involved in other situations. But what's going on now is that the United States has requested that he be returned, and every single government that's going to deal with him is going to have to deal with the United States government after the fact. Ecuador, which is where he was planning on going, happens to have a trade agreement with the United States coming up for renewal toward the end of the summer. And guess what? They're going to delay any approval of a asylum request for Snowden until after that approval has gone through. If Congress could potentially say, we're going to approve it, and it'll continue to exist as long as you don't allow Snowden in. They could do that. I don't know if they will, but it's certainly possible. And by executive order, the president could put a kibosh on the whole agreement anyway. So there are any number of things that could happen, and governments are very reluctant now to take on Snowden because he's not going to provide anything for them except damaging their relationship with the United States. So the man is sitting in the airport in Moscow and really has nowhere to go. Even Russia doesn't want to take any authority over him because then they would potentially have to send him. So they don't even want to process him and have him go through customs there because of that. Another article that I wanted to make you aware of just very briefly here. There is now a movement in the Arab community in Israel to join the army. And there's a great article just today, if you get a chance to look at it, written by Elchanan Miller, called In Arab Israel, a Battle Over Christian Conscription. So I hope you'll take a look at that. I may talk about it at a future show, but right now we're going to take a break for the whole summer, or for much of the summer. I'll be back mid-August, and I hope you'll have a wonderful summer. This has been Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.